The Acts of the Apostles is really the story of the early church, and St. Luke, the author of the Acts of the Apostles, sets out three sections of this period when he recalls Jesus' words to the apostles. You shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem and in all Judea and Samaria and to the end of the earth. Act 1 of this period will focus on Jesus' sending of his Spirit and the apostles' witness to those in Jerusalem. Act 2 will see the scattering of the early Christians due to persecution, with the result that the gospel reaches into Judea and Samaria. Finally, Act 3 will highlight the church's mission to the Gentiles and the expansion of the gospel to the end of the earth. Luke begins the book of Acts by reminding his audience that in his earlier book, that is, the Gospel of Luke, he related all that Jesus began to do and teach. This short statement highlights Luke's understanding that the story of Jesus in the Gospels continues in the life of the church. A careful reading of Acts reveals that the stories of Peter and Paul contain many important parallels to the story of Jesus. For example, we see the Holy Spirit descend upon Jesus prior to his public ministry. In the book of Acts, at Pentecost, we see the Holy Spirit descend upon the church. The Holy Spirit is a major force in the book of Acts, and this book has often been called the Gospel of the Holy Spirit. And we will see the Holy Spirit working through the early church, particularly in the figure of St. Peter in the beginning of the book, and very much so through St. Paul in what comprises the second half of the book of Acts. The book of Acts covers the period of early church history from approximately 33 AD to the years around 63 to 67 AD, beginning with the resurrection and the ascension of Jesus, and ending with the deaths of St. Peter and St. Paul in Rome. And while the book of Acts does not detail Peter and Paul's deaths, Christian tradition has passed on how Peter and Paul were both caught up in the Emperor Nero's persecution and executed on the same day. According to tradition, Peter asked to be crucified upside down, as he felt unworthy to be put to death in the same manner as Jesus. And because Paul's Roman citizenship did not permit his crucifixion, he was beheaded. And St. Paul, in a very prophetic way, just years before they both suffered this kind of grim end to their lives, he says in his letter to the Romans, "Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or persecution or famine or peril or the sword? No, in all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loves us." So for Paul, and I am sure for Peter as well, it was the love of God, the love of Jesus, that motivated them to preach in the midst of persecution and even put their lives on the line for the sake of the gospel. "10 days after Jesus' ascension, the disciples, about 120 according to Luke's count, are all gathered in one place. Jesus had instructed them to wait for the Holy Spirit to come to them, and they waited for 9 days, and that is where the tradition of the novena prayer comes from, that these disciples were waiting for 9 days for the Holy Spirit, and this is a tradition, this 9 days of prayerful reflection and anticipation that is continued in the church even to this day. As the story goes, they are waiting, prayerfully waiting, and the room that they are in is filled with a great wind, and all the disciples are filled with the Holy Spirit, manifested as tongues of fire, as you see in the image here. After receiving the Holy Spirit, the once fearful and hesitant disciples are now boldly proclaiming the good news of Jesus Christ. With the outpouring of the Holy Spirit, the Jews who had made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem from all over the Roman world hear the preaching of Peter and the disciples in their own native languages. This miraculous gift of tongues is a profound sign that recalls the confusion of tongues at the Tower of Babel. In the Tower of Babel, because of sin, humanity was divided and communication disrupted by diverse languages. Now, with the manifestation of God's Holy Spirit, people from different nations all hear and understand Peter's proclamation of Jesus. With Pentecost, Babel begins to be reversed, and God begins to regather humanity into his Catholic, that is, universal, family. Saint Stephen is described in the book of Acts as a man full of faith and the Holy Spirit. He was one of the first deacons of the church and taught the good news of Jesus with enthusiasm. This, of course, put him at risk for persecution, and he was, in fact, stoned to death. And as he was being killed, he certainly identifies with Jesus as he prays for those who were killing him, asking that the sin not be held against them. The murder of Stephen inaugurates an all-out persecution against the church, led by none other than Saul of Tarsus, who we may know as St. Paul. Luke simply states, Saul laid waste the church, and entering house after house, he dragged off men and women and committed them to prison. The early church is scattered into Judea and Samaria. Instead of destroying the Christian faith, this spreads its seeds into the wind, and it is blown across the world, settling wherever there is good soil in which it can grow and yield 100-fold. So the spread of the early church is very much inspired and motivated, certainly by the early witnesses or martyrs of the church, St. Stephen being one of them. And you can see this quote here from one of the early church fathers, Tertullian, who says that the blood of the martyrs is the seed of the church. Men and women willing to preach under persecution and to even give up their lives for the sake of the Gospels provide a strong and powerful witness to their devotion to God in the reality of Jesus Christ.